Fred had not known peace for days since that encounter on the football field, an encounter that had stirred up what he had long suppressed and sealed him into a feeling from which he could not find release. His presence grew thinner, almost transparent, as though he moved through his own life only as a shadow, repeating gestures without the strength to truly perform them. He spoke less and more softly, as if his words had turned fragile, defenseless, as though any thought spoken too loudly might shatter the carefully guarded silence in which he hid himself. Sleep was no longer a refuge, nor food a remedy. All that remained was that single image, that one scene, replayed endlessly, rewound like the worn tape of an old film. Anya, her face bent tenderly over the little girl, her arms wrapping her with a security only a mother could give, her smile at once slender and strong, too steeped in experience to be merely joyous, and yet too genuine to be false. That smile carved itself deeper into his thoughts, until he understood that no self-deception could shield him from it any longer. Behind her gaze, he recognized the pain, old, weary pain that appeared rarely, but once it came, it stayed, like an exposed wound. It was the same pain that had crushed him years ago, when his wife slipped away from the silence of his embrace, while he, powerless, tried to hold her back with the strength of his love, as if love could ever stand between life and death. That moment had etched itself into his heart as a wound that would never heal, but bled ceaselessly beneath a thin veil of pretense. And now, when he saw Anya, all he had buried for years awoke again, as though it had never slept at all. Saturdays for Fred had always carried a sacred rhythm, days when the world folded into silence and tears, days when he returned to Rosalie, when he took Matilda to her mother's grave. This Saturday was no different. The rain fell in a steady drizzle, persistent, as though the heavens themselves were mimicking their grief, turning it into a steady melody of drops falling upon the earth. At Matilda's door, he paused for a moment, then knocked gently and stepped inside. He found her already prepared, as if she too felt the unwritten rule of these days. She wore black leggings and a chestnut-colored sweatshirt, wide and softer than she was, while her long, curly hair spilled in a disheveled tangle. Fred smiled quietly, moved closer, and picked up the comb, carefully gathering those restless curls into a bun, tenderly, almost ritualistically, as though every strand carried its own weight, its own place, its own meaning. In those curls he saw Rosalie, her freedom, her wild spirit, everything that had long since vanished, yet lived on still in their daughter. "Daddy, look what I drew for Mom today," she whispered, as though entrusting a secret the walls themselves must not hear. In her smile, there was determination, yet also the fragility of a smile struggling to survive. Fred fastened her bun skillfully, pin by pin. "Show me," he said, his voice carrying all his attention, and all his fear that it might tremble too much. Matilda nestled into his lap, with the kind of trust that was both comfort and burden, and showed him the drawing. On the paper was a great, colorful butterfly, its wings painted in blues, purples, and golden shades, each color laid down with a child's serious devotion, as though she wished this butterfly to be perfect, worthy of fluttering above the earth. Fred held her close, carefully, afraid he might break something precious within that embrace, and he breathed in the scent of her hair, the scent of childhood, of safety, of life persisting despite everything. "Do you think Mom will like it?" she asked, lifting her eyes to him, eyes that carried part of Rosalie and part of himself, eyes always too honest to bear comforting lies. Fred swallowed the lump caught between his heart and throat and managed to say, "Of course, sweetheart, she'll be delighted. You know your mom loves every drawing you make." His smile was weak, yet enough, and in the touch of his lips to her temple was the same tenderness with which he had once kissed Rosalie, as though by that gesture he could reclaim what had long been taken from him. Then Matilda stood, more briskly than he expected, and reached for her small wooden basket. She placed the drawing inside, with the solemn seriousness of a child that always tore at his heart, as if every object, every paper, every color was a vow, an unbroken promise to keep her bond with her mother alive. She turned to him. "I'm ready." Fred rose, took her hand, and in that hand, small yet firm, he felt the fragile but living heart he had to protect. Together, they stepped into the silence waiting outside. Each step pulled him back into memory, and the rain reminded him of that day when Rosalie was lost to him forever. That sudden, terrible moment when her breath failed in his arms and her gaze went dark, like a candle snuffed out by a draft. She had been only 29, young, full of life, or so it seemed, and he had done everything in his power to save her. Everything except the impossible. Love had proved powerless before the body's decision to cease its fight, and an embrace could not hold a heart that had chosen to stop. That vision had never left him, and did not leave him now as he walked beside Matilda. Her small hand was his anchor, a reminder he still had reason to breathe. But another part of him, the quieter part, stubbornly looked back into the shadows that refused to release him. He knew that the love he had lost and the love he still held were not two separate things. And somewhere deep inside, though he did not dare let it surface fully, he sensed that perhaps, just perhaps, fate had never closed all its doors. That somewhere, beyond all the losses and wounds, a door or two might still stand slightly ajar. It happened in the height of summer, in a July that felt more like autumn than the season when sunlight ought to spill its golden rays across the rooftops. It was the 16th day of that month, and the rain had been falling without pause, streaming for days down windows, turning the whole landscape into a damp, gray mirror. The sky wept, as if it foresaw a loss yet to come, as though it already recognized what had not yet unfolded, but hovered, unspoken, in the air of their home. Rosalie, his wife, was a stand-up comedian, an amateur by profession, but never in passion. She traveled nearly every weekend, venturing to towns she had never before seen, to small halls and large stages, always with that same company of people who, like her, sought refuge in laughter, as though humor could rewrite their wounds and mask the sorrow quietly gnawing at them all. That was her escape, her outlet, her way of staying alive. At that time, Fred lived a quieter life in his workshop. His hands, accustomed to heavy labor, to scars and small cuts, turned gentle when they touched clay. He would watch the material yield to his fingers and shape it patiently, as though in each bowl, plate, and vase he left a fragment of his breath, of his silent thoughts. The workshop did not bring him wealth, but it gave him something else, an enduring sense that what he created might outlast him. For him, it was a form of prayer, of meditation, of quiet defiance against impermanence. Yet while he found peace in that simple silence by day, his wife left him by night. Rosalie departed to entertain strangers, to share parts of herself with people he did not know, while he remained in the house, alone with the child, alone with walls that echoed more often with silence than with warmth. Their daughter often spent hours in the workshop. Rosalie was often away, and Fred refused to leave her unattended. At first it had seemed like an adventure, this child among pots and clay figurines, smiling with hands stained in paint, hair tangled with specks of dust. There was something almost magical in it. But time did what it always does. Greater responsibility fell upon his shoulders, heavier loneliness pressed on him, and the love that had once been noisy and playful began to fall silent. Rosalie still carried her smile before their child, her gift of jokes, and the warmth in her voice. But when the house sank into night, when the small head rested upon the pillow, between them spread a chill they no longer knew how to dispel. Her words grew fewer, her touch almost absent, her gaze distant. The door between them was shut, and the harder he tried to open it, the more firmly it locked. That morning, the 16th of July, after dropping their daughter at kindergarten, Fred saw her returning from Birmingham. Rain streamed through her hair, but on her face was a smile, an unusual smile, exaggerated, almost unnatural, a smile that did not belong to him. He stood on the doorstep, watching her approach beneath the gray sky, and in that moment, he realized he no longer recognized the woman for whom he had once been ready to give up everything. Her clothing was unfamiliar, shirts and trousers he had never seen before, cuts and colors that did not belong to their world. And when she passed him, she neither looked at him nor spoke a word. He followed her, his steps short, almost frantic. Helplessness swelled in his chest, fear coiled in his stomach. "Talk to me," he shouted, just as she slammed the bedroom door in his face. He no longer thought. He opened it and stepped inside after her. Rosalie was tossing clothes from the wardrobe, his shirts, his trousers, casting them out of her life. He moved toward her and took her hands. "What are you doing, Rose? Look at me. Tell me what is happening." In his voice was despair, in his trembling hands, helplessness. She looked at him, and in her gaze there was nothing left of what had once belonged to her. "I'm done, Fred. It's over. You're the one who's leaving." Her voice was cold, sharp, unyielding, and it cut deeper than he had ever thought possible. He shook his head, and his eyes filled with pain. "I'm not going anywhere. Not until we talk. Not until you tell me the truth. I'm not blind, Rose." Her eyes hardened, her face flushed with anger, but behind the anger was fatigue, loss, perhaps the sense of having kept silent for too long. "You're no longer the man I fell in love with," she cried, her voice quivering. "Then tell me, who have I become? What have I done to you? Can't you see how hard I'm trying to stay present?" He pleaded, clutching at the last thread still binding them. She shook her head, tears brimming at the corners of her eyes, though her voice carried only fury. "You don't understand anything. You always thought it was enough just to be here. But you haven't seen me, Fred. You haven't seen me in months." He looked at her, and from his lips came a sentence that struck between them like a blow. "I see you now, and it hurts that I no longer recognize you." At this, she stopped and raised her hand, pointing to the scattered clothes upon the bed. "These are not my clothes. Either you leave or I will. And if I go, I'm taking our daughter with me." His world trembled, and panic surged to his throat. "You will not take my child from me." Their quarrel turned into a battle beyond return, words clashing like blades, and all that had smoldered between them for years now flared into open fire. Then she left. She vanished down the stairs, through the rain, to her car. Fred shouted after her, but she did not stop. He ran, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum before battle. He slid into his car, the engine roared, and he followed her through the drenched streets. He called her again and again, but she did not answer her phone. Until at last she did. "I'm not finished," he said the moment he heard her breath. "Rose, let's talk. Let's fix this." She was silent, and that silence cut deeper than any word. "What did I do?" he asked, while rain hammered against the glass and his breath broke in his chest. Then her voice reached him, quiet, drained, lifeless. "I saw her." He froze, pressure mounting at his temples. "Who? Who did you see?" he asked, unaware of his own fear. "Your mistress." She said it calmly, almost coldly. The world collapsed in that single sentence. Everything stopped. The engine, the rain, the street, the lights. He did not know what hurt more, that she accused him, or that he had lost her before he could speak the truth, or before he could even ask himself whether the truth existed. Rage burst from him, like glass shattering beneath sudden pressure. "What mistress? I don't have a mistress, Rosalie. Have you lost your mind? Have you gone completely mad?" he shouted, in a voice that no longer felt like his own, a voice he did not recognize. But she laughed, not the laughter that could save, but a cynical, hollow laugh, stripped of warmth, as if mocking him from afar, as if telling him the battle was already lost. "Oh, Freddie," she murmured through her teeth, and that scorn wounded him deeper than any accusation. He gripped the wheel, his knuckles turning white, his breath ragged and broken, as though his strength to fight was draining away. "You attack me with your silence, Rose, with your absence, and now with these lies. Why are you doing this to me?" he said, and in his voice there was no longer only anger, but also the desperate plea of a man asking his last question to the woman he still loved. "Oh, Freddie," she repeated, but this time softer, almost tender. And it was precisely because of that tenderness that every word from her lips cut like poison. "You didn't tell me she was your mistress." He was struck dumb. His heart pounded like a bird trapped in a cage, wings battering the iron bars while suffocating in its own fear. Fred's voice came out wounded, worn thin, like a string stretched too many times and now trembling on the edge of breaking. "Rosalie!" he cried, but weaker this time, almost pleading, his words slipping off his tongue like the confession of a man drowning in his own thoughts. "I don't have a mistress. I swear to you, Rose." The rain drummed relentlessly against the windshield, heavy drops streaming down the glass like tears the sky itself could not hold back. Helpless to make sense of her accusations, he pressed harder on the accelerator, unwilling to lose sight of her car. The gray Mitsubishi glided down the wet asphalt, fleeing before him like the shadow of a past that refused to let him go. "Enlighten me then, if you know more than I do," he continued, his voice saturated with despair and the unbearable weariness of a man who had carried the weight of misunderstanding for too long. "Tell me, who is this supposed woman? I'm exhausted, Rose. My soul is exhausted. This tension between us has been dragging on for months. I keep trying, always trying to talk, to reach you, but you're somewhere far away. You don't exist anymore, in our home. You don't exist beside me. Where have you gone, Rose? Where have we gone?" As he spoke,
His eyes searched for hers through the side window, and for a fleeting instant he found them. In that gaze, which she tried to hold firm and unyielding, there was something irreparable, something that left the taste of bitter premonition in his throat. "Your daughter. I saw her too." The words sliced through him like a cold knife. His heart jolted in his chest, his thoughts scattering into chaotic spirals from which there was no escape. The voice that had resisted until then began to splinter, fragile, cracking beneath the weight of colliding truths and fears. "I know, Freddie. I've known for a long time. I've known for years. But I don't have the strength to pretend anymore. The truth is choking me, and I can't run from it any longer." Her words grew weaker, strangled by her own tears as they streamed down her face. In her voice was the pain of a woman who still loved, but even more the pain of a woman who could no longer forgive. Fred felt the world collapsing around him as she spoke the words he had never wanted to hear, as though the ground beneath both the car and his very existence fractured and vanished. "Pull over," he said quietly, hoarsely, his voice strangled by disbelief. "Stop, now." His head throbbed with dissonance, her words echoing in him like a gong, shattering every thought into fragments. Daughter? His daughter. What kind of words were these? He slammed the brakes. The car skidded, swerving across the slick asphalt, and came to a halt at the very edge of the road. Through the open window, a heavy smell of smoke began to spread, mingling with the damp and the gasoline. His whisper was the last flicker of hope. "Rose." Then the world exploded. First came the sound of shattering, the crash, a scream that fused with the thunder above, and then the blast. A towering flame erupted from the ditch by the roadside, defying the rain as though hell itself had chosen to devour the night. Waves of smoke swallowed the horizon, blackening everything that once had color, erasing every trace of life from the scene before his eyes. Fred ran. His legs carried him without thought, slipping down the muddy embankment until he collapsed into the nightmare that tore his soul apart. Her body lay upon the rain-soaked asphalt, motionless, fragile as glass, shattered 1,000 times over. "Rose!" he roared, his voice more like a death cry than a call, a sound torn from the depths of his being. He fell to his knees, his palms slapping the wet earth, then reached out and gently touched her face, though streaked with blood and carved by pain. He was terrified to move her, afraid that the slightest touch might scatter her into countless pieces, yet he had to feel her once more, to hold her, to refuse to let go. The cry that tore from his lungs was the wail of a lost child, shrill and helpless before the immensity of tragedy. His hands were useless, mere shadows clawing desperately at the life that was slipping away from her. Somewhere in the distance, sirens pierced the night, drawing closer, but Fred no longer knew if they were real or only the tricks of a mind unraveling. His world was here, with her, in a colorless void where the only sounds were the pounding of his own frantic heart and her breath that was fading. And then a movement happened, a faint stir, fragile, barely perceptible, yet enough to steal his breath away. Her eyes found his for the last time, held him there, and upon her lips flickered the smallest of smiles, bloodied, broken, trembling, yet still full of love. "I love you, and forgive me." Those words were the end, spoken as both vow and farewell, as her eyelids sank into the calm, inevitable descent into silence. Fred released a scream no human throat should ever produce, raw and terrible, the cry of a man from whom half a soul had been torn away. Her rain-drenched curls slipped through his fingers as he tried to cling to what he could no longer save. The mother of his child, the woman of his life, was slipping from his hands. The sirens grew louder, flashing lights cut through the dusk. Paramedics rushed forward, their hands falling upon his shoulders. "Sir," came a quiet voice, but Fred did not hear them. His world was nailed to her still face, serene and peaceful, as though in that final second she had found escape from every wound. And then came the words that shattered the last remnants of hope. "We can only confirm the death." At that moment, Fred's body betrayed him. The pain was too vast, and the dark void swallowed him whole, leaving him collapsed upon the wet road, her blood on his hands, and the silence that had forever changed the course of his life. Frederick Stevenson was weary in a way that surpassed any ordinary word a man might use to describe exhaustion. It was not the fatigue of the body that could be lifted by sleep, nor the daily weariness that dissolves in a brief pause, but a deep, silent, unrelenting emptiness that had gnawed at his soul for years, leaving him spent and hushed, a shadow of the man he had once been. And yet, even in that weariness, even with the weight etched into his every movement, he stood tall, with a faint, almost imperceptible smile, while his hazel eyes, brushed with the gray gleam of clouds, remained unshaken as they rested on the little girl before him, the child who was his entire world and the only reason he still drew breath. Memories wrapped around him like faded slides, casting before his gaze scenes he could never entirely suppress. They were not tender nor sweet, but bitter and raw, and still he clung to them, for they were all that remained of her. He walked through the past as though down a misty corridor, colliding with recollections that hurt him, yet at the same time were the only thread binding him to Rosalie. He watched as Matilda laid yet another drawing upon the cold marble of her mother's grave, fragile and silent, with a gesture startlingly adult, and in that moment, Frederick once again felt the crushing thought rise that his daughter had lost her childhood on the very day she lost her mother. Later, they stopped at the park, by the little pond where they fed the ducks, finding brief comfort in that place of stillness and unspoken understanding. They sat side by side, each in the company of their own thoughts, while the ducks drifting across the calm surface of the water gave the only rhythm that accompanied them. Afterward, as they had done so many times before, they went to the small fast food restaurant, a place Rosalie had always called their tiny oasis of normalcy, as if the sheer ordinariness of eating from plastic containers carried with it a kind of comfort. Fred ordered Matilda's favorite burger and added another serving of fries, more out of the need to shield her from every possible emptiness than out of hunger, as though in that excess of food lay the illusion of safety. While Matilda sat scribbling across a sheet of paper, trying through her lines to color thoughts she did not know how to turn into words, Fred reached out and brushed a stray curl behind her ear, his fingertips barely grazing the silver earring that glimmered in the light. That quiet, almost invisible gesture was his way of protecting her, of showing tenderness when he knew no other way to comfort. He watched her lose herself in her drawings, and then, with a note of strain in his voice, he spoke softly, afraid to disturb the fragile silence between them. "May I talk to you, darling?" His voice was gentle, yet within it flickered a shadow of unease. Matilda nodded, though she did not look at him, continuing to drag her pencil across the page. "Daddy would like to ask you something," he added, choosing his words like a man who knows each one could drag him into the depths of his own fears. "What is it, Daddy?" she asked quietly, fiddling with the pencil tip, and Fred continued to twirl her curl between his fingers, as though in that tender gesture he found his last anchor. He hesitated, torn between the need to know and the fear of what he might hear, but at last he voiced the question that had pressed on him for days. "When did you meet Kai?" The girl lifted her gaze, startled by the question, then frowned as she absent-mindedly rubbed her eraser against her brow. "Kai?" she repeated thoughtfully. "Which Kai?" "The little girl with the blonde hair," Frederick said softly, almost cautiously. "You quarreled with her at the football game." Matilda leaned back in the leather chair and crossed her arms, as though trying to shield herself from the conversation. "Oh, that Kai. I don't know her, Daddy." "No?" he echoed, a trace of tension in his voice, listening to her every word. "It seemed as though the two of you couldn't quite get along. Is that true?" Matilda nodded, briefly and reluctantly. "Why?" Fred asked, more eager to hear her voice than expecting an explanation. "Her group came over a few times with a teacher, and we played, but she always ignores us. She doesn't like to play with anyone, only with her teacher." She lowered her gaze once again to the paper and went on scribbling, as though the drawing could shield her from the discomfort of the questions. "Does she speak?" Frederick asked in almost a whisper, biting the inside of his lip. "No," she replied softly. "Only with her teacher, and with her hands." She tried awkwardly to imitate the movements with her fingers, then shook her head. "I don't like her. She's strange. I don't want to play with her." Fred sat in silence, staring at the table, while his thoughts drifted toward a direction that unsettled him. He was almost certain now that Kai was indeed deaf, and within that quiet realization lurked a shadow he could not yet name. He did not know what this meant, nor what truth it might uncover, but of one thing he was certain. Those blue eyes, large and innocent, brimming with silent sorrow, were not the eyes of a stranger. They were eyes that haunted him, eyes he had seen once before, and perhaps, in some distant life, had even loved. The waitress arrived with their order, setting the tray down gently without disturbing their conversation. Fred gave her a polite smile and thanked her, while Matilda pushed aside her paper and leaned a little closer to the table, unconsciously seeking his presence. He drew her chair in nearer, then snatched a fry and offered it to her with a smile, seeking in that small gesture the semblance of normality. Together they began their meal, as though the familiar taste of their food could, if only for a fleeting moment, return them to a peace denied to them, or at least to the illusion that life was still as it ought to be. That night, sleep eluded Fred like a relentless ghost of the past, fleeing from him without rest and leaving him trapped within the walls of his own thoughts. He lay beneath the sheets, turning from side to side, but slumber would not come, as if some deep unrest had taken residence in his chest, refusing him even a moment's reprieve. This was not ordinary fatigue, not the kind that dissolves with sleep, but a weariness woven with shame and an unnamed sorrow. This was something that weighed upon him and suffocated him in equal measure. At last, he admitted defeat and sat up, nearly staggering, aware that he could no longer pretend to be at peace. The blanket slid from the bed as he moved toward the desk, his fingers brushing uncertainly against the cold plastic of his laptop. When the screen lit up the darkness, casting its pale glow over the corner of the table and the old lampshade that flickered as though unwilling to witness his insomnia, Fred felt only emptiness. Neither the sterile light nor the endless scroll of pages before him offered what he sought. He did not even know what exactly he was searching for. His patience had long since burned away, and with a sharp, frustrated movement, he snapped the laptop shut, as though silencing the unrest inside him with the echo of that sound. He reached for his phone, the sigh that escaped him resounding in the silence like an admission of defeat, and began flicking through apps with trembling fingers, nervous, frantic, like a man grasping at reeds in murky water. Anya Woodberg, he muttered under his breath, typing the name, searching for a face, a profile, even a single picture that might restore a sense of certainty, or at the very least, confirm that it hadn't all been a figment of his imagination. But there was nothing, as though she had vanished from the digital world, erasing every trace of herself. No photographs, no pixelated fragments of memory, only absence, and that absence hurt more than any truth could. He was on the verge of surrendering to exhaustion when, suddenly, an idea flared in his mind, faint but insistent, refusing to let him go. His fingers, almost of their own accord, navigated to the Instagram page of the children's football team to which Matilda belonged. The profile was modest, followed by only a handful of parents, coaches, and children who occasionally wished to share the joy of the game. But perhaps, just perhaps, he might find the trace he so desperately sought. He scrolled carefully, retracing posts until he reached the date of the match that refused to leave his memory. His heart hammered, measuring the moments slipping away. On one photograph, Matilda appeared in an oversized jersey, arms raised, radiant with victory. In another, she stood in the background, blurred among other girls. Fred's eyes fixed on those indistinct figures, desperately searching for a single face, the one etched into his memory. But Kai was not there. Our own pressed into his chest, and the breath that left him was heavy, like a quiet surrender. And yet, his finger brushed the follower count. The list of names unfolded before him, and among dozens of random accounts, one stopped him cold, striking him in the gut. Ephemera 94. The profile was private, but its image, a woman's silhouette holding a child's hand, bathed in the gold of sunset, clutched his heart so fiercely that he thought he might run out of air. The face was blurred and shadowed, but he knew. Even through filters, even through pixels, he knew. It was her, Anya. Ephemera 94, he whispered, as if afraid someone might overhear, staring at the username as though it was a code he had never learned to decipher. The year fit. Anya was born in 1994. But it was the word that unsettled him most. Ephemera. Transient. Fleeting. Like breath on glass. Like shadow on water. Like she herself, who had passed through his life and disappeared, yet left behind a trace he could never erase. Why choose that word? Why cloak herself in that name, if not as a testament to all they had been and all they had lost? His teeth closed on his lower lip, unthinking, while his heart raced, not from fear but from longing, from an ache that swelled into something unbearable. Everything blurred, became unreal, as though he was standing at the edge of a precipice from which either truth or illusion would emerge, and he was afraid to take the step. He captured the screen in a hurried screenshot, almost panicked, as if terrified that the account might vanish, as if this last fragile thread of hope might dissolve like everything else had. He knew he had to speak to her, no longer from mere curiosity, no longer to confirm suspicions, but for the questions that had weighed on him for years, questions older than time and deeper than grief. He needed to know the truth. He needed to know if she was truly there, and more than that, if the child who haunted his thoughts, the child with the blue eyes, was in fact bound to his world in a way he could not yet bring himself to voice. The phone's clock read nearly 4 in the morning, But Fred felt no trace of sleep. A quiet flame burned in him, something between adrenaline and yearning that would not let him close his eyes. He bounced his leg nervously, rubbed his throbbing temples, then dragged both hands through his hair, lowering his face into his palms, as though he could hold back the storm unraveling inside him. And in that gray silence, from the very depths of his mind, surfaced a question he was afraid to speak aloud. A question that sounded at once like a prayer and a curse, a hope and a sentence. "Are you truly mine, Kai Woodberg?"